What does it look like to build a culture of empathy that makes people feel engaged and where they want to show up? Those are sorts of things that we have typically not trained and developed all that well that are now taking on an increasing focus. So it's not just sort of the people we're bringing into the workforce. For me, it's also the retraining and reskilling of all of us who are already in career and thinking about how do I continue to add value and play a role as the workplace dramatically reinvents itself.
Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead, and our conversations with leaders and executives explores the skills, strategies and mindsets that is needed to thrive in this ever-evolving landscape of the future. So whether you are a seasoned executive, an aspiring leader, or simply curious about the future of leadership, we are here to give you practical insights to unlock your potential, change the status quo, and break open our assumptions on how work works. Produced in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives, Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change. Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Some people talk about leadership, and then there's Holly Ransom, who lives it like a firecracker on a mission. In this episode of Future Fit Leadership, I had the absolute joy of speaking with a woman who's been called one of the most influential voices on the planet under 40. And once you hear her speak, you'll understand why. Holly is not just a global keynote speaker or the CEO of Emergent. She's a force of nature who spent her life chasing one big, bold question. What does it take to lead from the edge of possibility? She's interviewed Barack Obama, chaired a G20 Youth Summit, and been on Richard Branson's dream team to end modern slavery. But let me tell you, behind every accolade is a story. A woman who wasn't always the loudest in the room, a girl who was raised by the kind of wisdom you can't find on Google or ChatGPT. And this is where the story gets personal. One of the most profound lessons Holly carries is from her grandmother, a woman who left school at 12, ran the family farm, raised 5 children, and showed up every single day with grit, grace, and quiet power. She once told Holly, if you walk past it, you're telling the world it's okay. That one sentence changed Holly's life. It became the moral compass she's used to navigate rooms where she's been the youngest, the only woman, or asking the hardest question. And maybe that's why mattering has become such a defining theme in Holly's work. Because at the core of her leadership philosophy is this idea that every human being wants to matter. Not to be the loudest or the smartest or the one with the corner office, but to know that who they are and what they do makes a difference, that they belong and that they count. We talk in this episode about the cost of waiting until you feel ready and why leadership isn't a moment of arrival, but a series of brave, clumsy, consistent choices. Holly shares what it's really like to chair her first board meeting at 19, the adrenaline, the doubt, and the decision to show up anyway. She reminds us that courage isn't about having no fear. It's about being more committed to impact than comfort. We also unpacked allyship, visibility, burnout, and why leaders need to invest their energy where it matters the most, in people. She challenges us to be bold enough to ask, what's my leadership for? And honest enough to admit when we've fallen into performative patterns rather than purposeful ones. There's humor, there's honesty, there's a kind of insight that stays with you long after the conversation ends. So if you've ever felt invisible in a room or unsure whether your voice is the one people need to hear, let Holly remind you that leadership doesn't begin when you're chosen. It begins when you choose to speak up, to show up, to matter. Please enjoy my wonderful conversation with the extraordinary Holly Ransom. Well, hello, Holly. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership. So nice to meet you, and thank you for making the time for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I've got a whole range of meandering questions, as I said to you off air, but I want to start by asking what you were like growing up, because, for most of us, we've watched your career from afar and you've had a very successful career, but were you the young girl who was really clear on what you wanted to be?
Oh, I don't know if I could go that far. I think I went through the normal twists and turns that every small child does, where at some point they want to be a marine biologist. And then I think if you went and read my scrapbook in year three, I'd written that I wanted to be the Brownlow medalist. At that point, having no idea I wasn't going to be able to, as a young woman at that stage, pursue a long career in my budding Auskick life at that
Yeah.
point. So I think I went through this, that, and the other, certainly. But I was very fortunate to have the very strong example of my grandmother very early in my life, who always described me as someone that was born in perpetual motion, which I always thought was quite funny, always on the go, always trying to do something. But I think the thing for me that she really instilled in me was, a day where we were out at a shopping centre waiting in line to buy a couple of groceries before we were heading back to make lunch for myself and my brothers. And this guy that was in the line at the supermarket started chewing into the young girl that was on the checkout. And I remember she looked very young, like probably someone that was at school, teenager or something like that. And this guy seemed like a giant, at that stage I was 4 or 5 years old. He was a very tall man. And before I even blinked, my 5 foot tall grandmother had inserted herself between this gentleman that was having a go at this young woman and the poor young woman, and sort of said to him, how dare you speak to that young lady like that? You apologise. I remember watching someone who didn't look like he'd been stopped in his tracks many times in his life. It took a few moments to register what was going on. Then he sort of, mumbled sorry and wandered out of the store. My grandmother proceeded like nothing had happened. She just sort of bought her things, headed out of the supermarket before she realised I was still sort of fixed back in position watching all this play out. And I said to her, Grandma, that's so brave. And she said to me, honey, if you walk past it, you tell the world it's okay. And I think for me, not only was I so lucky, I didn't understand that line for a long time, but I understood the example of what my grandmother did, that within each of our power every day in small interactions, right the way through to, that one maybe feels a little bit bigger, but in reality, stepping in a moment where it demanded it to change the course of an event, that was a gift. And I didn't realise it probably till I was in my mid-20s, sort of looking back at how I'd made decisions and choices around everything from what student society to get involved in when I was at university through to what jobs I took and the like, that in many ways it had always been informed by not wanting to walk past something. And so that lesson really stuck. And while I didn't know what I wanted to do in the sense of, doctor, lawyer, this and that and the other, I knew this idea that when I came across things that I didn't want to walk past, I sort of dug my heels in and said, okay, well, how can I, with my skills and capabilities, do something about this?
She sounds like an incredible woman, as you said, 5 foot nothing, but
Totally.
with a lot of power.
A lot of power. And that's one of the things I loved about it too, is that early lesson in leadership. And I still don't think it's something we appreciate enough, the idea of not needing a title to lead. My grandmother wasn't manager in that store. In many ways, she was maybe one of the least likely people to step in and intervene. There were other people that were of a similar gender, of a similar stature, this sort of stuff that were all in that proximate area. And yet she was the one that sort of stepped in and did something about it. So for me, a lot of my early lessons in leadership around how you treat people, whether for better, like in terms of how she always made people feel 11 foot tall after they, had an interaction with her, through to for worse and what you need to do to step in when people are being disrespected, like she did on that day. A lot of my early leadership lessons came from her.
And one of your mentors also once said to you, meet the people, feel the issues. I love
Yes.
the way, I love that saying. Tell me more about how that's played out for you.
Yeah, I love that line. And that comes from the incredible Jane Tewson. If you're not across Igniting Change's work, I encourage you to look up the organisation. Jane is a prolific change maker, started Comic Relief in the UK, has been running Igniting Change here in Australia, but one of the most under the radar, humble sort of impact leaders you'll meet. And one of the things she does really routinely is she has this philosophy of sort of, go meet the people, feel the issues. And the whole point there is that too many times we see solutions designed by people who don't have lived experience. And so Jane's whole mantra is to do a better job at creating sustainable and ultimately effective solutions, we need to be informed by the people who understand the topic of homelessness, the topic of drug addiction, what is going on for First Nations people in Australia, how women are experiencing domestic violence, and what might look like the help that they need. And I remember learning this myself when I was in Africa. I was working on a microfinance project when I was at uni. One of the clubs I was involved with was lucky enough to get the opportunity to go and work with an Australian charity to help out. They were doing work with kids in the slums of Corrigocho, and they realised quite readily that if it didn't change the reality for women, like the mums, they weren't actually going to be able to change the reality for these kids on any kind of sustainable basis. And I remember one particular day, we would teach in this giant corrugated iron sea container over one side of the slum, and we'd gone to meet with a tribal chief, and we were walking back sort of via a side of the slum that we hadn't been through yet. And about 400 metres on the backside of the corrugated iron sea container, we stumbled on what looked like a brand new well, which struck me as really strange because for the longest time in our experience there, we'd been there probably a week or two at that stage, we'd been told that the closest water supply was some distance away. Like you had to walk over 1.5 kilometres to get there. And so it was a big part of the daily piece, getting the water, bringing it back, etc. And so I said through our interpreter, hold on, isn't that a well? And the answer came back, well, yeah, it is. And I said, well, is it broken? And the answer came back, no, it's not. And I said, well, why aren't we drinking the water from that well? Because I'm not going to say who, but this was built with probably $25,000 worth of aid money by an organisation you and I and everyone listening would know very well. And the answer came back, well, it's built on ancient burial grounds. And so there's bad spirits in the ground. And so we can't drink the water from that well, or we'll get bad spirits in us and we'll die. Now, if you'd given me a million guesses as a young change maker working in the slums, I never would have gotten to that conclusion. But the point is, if anyone working on that project had asked anyone in that community where to build the well, they would have said 200 metres in the opposite direction. Yeah. And you would have had a well that was servicing thousands of people on a daily basis and fundamentally sort of changing the realities. And so for me, that's always been sort of what I think of when I think of Jane's mantra, is this idea of, how are you seeking to understand before you seek to be understood? And it's such an easy bias to have when you come into situations, and particularly when there's imbalances in resources or those sorts of things, we can have a tendency to believe we've got all the answers. And I think that was a really good lesson for me early, and having mentors like Jane in my life, it's one you get continually reminded of, to make sure you're thinking about who it is that you're bringing the perspective of, as you think about solutioning, as you think about understanding the problem deeply and testing your ideas.
You've said that you don't rise to the level of your strategy, but that of our leadership capability. And many leaders today pride themselves on setting a really strong strategy. It's what, you learn one-on-one of leadership is you've got to set a really strong strategy and share your vision and, and have people follow you. But we both know that that's not as easy as that. What leadership traits or behaviours do you believe actually determine whether a leader is going to be successful in the strategy and vision and people following them rather than not?
I think it's a great question because it's one I see trip a lot of organisations up, and I'm sure many of the ones that you have worked with too. In many ways, it's not fair to say it's easy to create a powerful strategy. We've both been in those rooms. It takes a lot of thinking power. It takes a lot of refinement. It takes a lot of robust conversation. But I think the idea that your work is done when that piece of work is finished is sort of the mindset where we've gotten ourselves a little lost potentially. And that actually really isn't day one of the journey to go, okay, how do we get this embedded and how do we think about the actual execution of this piece? And I've worked in a number of big organisations, and this is probably where I had that experience of sort of you get the strategy done, be really fantastic, clear line of sight to how this would make an impact to the customer or, way this would innovate ahead of competitors and those sorts of things. Then you'd watch it gather dust in someone's desk drawer. And then sort of 6-12 months later, leadership had changed to some degree and someone new would come in and they'd want to put them imprimatur on the strategy. And so you'd go to another strategy offsite and off we go again. So look, I think the big things for me around strategy that ultimately sort of gets executed is the work that needs to be done to get buy-in and help people understand the reason why, because there's a level of habit, and we call them in business operating rhythm more than we call it habit, but we've got a level of we're accustomed to doing a certain work, to our team being rewarded for a certain type of output, to the idea that we are heading in this direction for these reasons. And I think sometimes we underestimate the communication work that needs to be done when we course correct. And I think strategy is a course correction. Like it might be minor in some instances, it might be major in others when you're, seeking to respond to a major disruption like AI. But the work that needs to be done to think about how do we communicate this in a powerful and compelling way that's going to motivate our people enough to get them to all of a sudden start doing things in a different manner and direction, or demand something of themselves that they haven't done for a period of time in order that we get this done. So I think the storytelling piece and the way that you can make that compelling. I think the other thing I noticed doing a lot of work in change and transformation is the idea that that's not a singular story, moment, narrative. And by that, I mean, I think one of the things we miss, and I noticed this a lot in the work around purpose too, but I think about 15 years ago when I was working in intergenerational engagement for the first time in businesses, then we didn't understand the why. Simon Sinek had just launched or popularized this idea into our vernacular. And a lot of companies, like one I can remember working with, very closely, that would struggle to articulate for you in a room, why would I get out of bed and come to this organisation? What 15 years on, I think we probably talk about it at every annual general meeting. What we maybe are not so good at though, or certainly the gap that I see in organisations, is that why hasn't found its way into our Monday morning meetings or our Wednesday afternoon whips. And particularly in the context of change, where we are continually having to remind people, continually having to put extra mile effort in to change the way that we're doing things, to refocus mindsets that need to be more deliberate and more consistent around that narrative piece. The expectation, I guess, on leaders as communicators, not just in the ability to be compelling and articulate that why, but that ability to keep coming back to it and finding ways to make it fresh and ultimately kind of embed it inside the organization's culture. I think that for me is a really big area of opportunity for emerging leaders coming through to add value into their organizations, because it's a core part not just of inspiring followership, but of maintaining it in moments that demand resilience of us. What we know is that purpose and recognition are two things that are absolutely critical to extra mile effort and to wanting to stick things out in tough moments. And so making sure that as a leader, I'm mindful of how am I articulating, and bringing us back to why we're doing this and why I need you to do this and why you doing it matters. And equally recognising contribution, effort and progress. They are two EQ components that I think are really critical to being able to be an effective leader at this moment in time and certainly moving forward.
You became the youngest ever board director in AFL history with the AFL Sporting Club. What has that time on that board taught you about culture and resilience and performance, bringing sport into business and business into sport as such?
Yeah, it's a favourite topic of mine, to be honest, because I'm surprised there isn't more cross-pollination in some ways between the two worlds.
I'm actually going to ask you why you think that's not something I've got in my mind as to, why is it that there isn't the cross-pollination?
Well, I first remember it. Stephen Moore, when he was captain of the Wallabies, reached out to me because he was leading a squad that were generationally quite different to him. And he said, I'd love to have some conversations and have you help me think through how do I connect with the younger members of my team. And I remember in the back and forths that we shared for a period of time, surprise that people in corporate life, because Stephen's gone on to have a great sort of corporate career post the Wallabies and was certainly had a foot in that world already at that stage. It's like, I can't believe with the pressure of decision-making and the performance expectations that more people in business don't consider themselves to be corporate athletes, because this idea that you can, particularly when he was talking about this, he was meaning rest, recovery, all these kind of hygiene factors that allow you to be in a place to think clearly under pressure and to engage stakeholders and bring people along for the journey, stuff that requires, a huge amount of energy impost. It always struck him as a curious gap. And I think in many ways it's because of just the KPIs and the performance expectations. I remember Venus Williams saying to me last year in a conversation we shared, it's amateurs who don't take breaks. High performers take breaks. And it's funny because you sit there and go, of course they do. Like, you're not going to be able to be any good by the time Wimbledon rolls around if you haven't had a break since Christmas. Like, that's just crazy. And that's the way athletes think, and the rhythm of sort of high performing clubs like Port Adelaide that I'm involved with. You've got days of the week and you've got periods of the day that are devoted to recovery and preparation, etc. And in the military, there's an awareness you cannot always be ready. You've got a period of readying, then you've got ready, and then you've got reset. And so most things that we look at from a kind of institutional mindset where they demand a high level of performance have that kind of built into them. I think in the corporate world, and I love your views on this, we've gone through such a period of wearing busy as a badge of honor that I think we have struggled to liberate ourselves from this idea that if my day is not full from 8 till 5 p.m. with meetings, or if I'm not exhausted at the end of the week, or if when someone asks me how I am, I don't say busy, then I'm clearly not high performing. And for me, there's such a gap between the idea of being busy and being effective. And I think AI is starting to show this up even more, because as we're starting to get that time back in our diary, the question I keep asking a lot of leaders is, okay, so if I can give you 5 hours back in a week, what's the highest value redistribution of that time? Where does it go for you? And most people don't have the answer because we're so accustomed to being on the hamster wheel. What's your thought?
I totally agree with you. I think we've spent so much time being busy, and it's almost justifying our time from, 7 a.m. in the morning till 7 p.m. at night. I've got to be seen as the CEO or leader who does those hours, because unless I'm doing those hours, I can't possibly be doing my job. And that's how I set the benchmark in my business. And I think, and I do agree with you, with AI coming in, being given back the gift of time. With a hybrid world of work, we're being given back the gift of time. So how are you going to spend it? Are you going to spend it on yourself? Are you going to spend it on your family? Are you going to spend it on your partner? I think spending it on yourself is critical. I just wish that boards would make wellness a part of a CEO's package.
Yeah.
And that they would send them away for 3 or 4 days to just disconnect and come back where they are fully recharged, send them to Gwingana for 7 days, part of their packaging. They come back fully recharged to be able to focus, to take the business to where it needs to be. But we are constantly on a treadmill going, 12, 13 hours a day. If we take a holiday, we take the phone with us. If we can't,
Totally.
The business can't.
Which is in defiance of everything we know about good breaks, right? Like,
right?
Being disconnected is or fully detached is very different to being semi-attached.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I keep saying to people I work with, none of us are saving lives. And if you're not saving lives, please go and have a break before we have to save your life,
I love that reframe. I often say that to my team, like, remember, like, nothing is so urgent. We are not in the business of sort of people relying on us in a life or death situation. But equally, I think we shouldn't make light of that. Some of the environments that I work in that I actually think have the biggest challenge around well-being are ones where that is the overarching, like when I look at the healthcare system and the challenges of a lot of the professionals I meet in that, which I absolutely understand there are real life and death consequences. But my concern around the reality of the life and death consequences for the way some people are living and the pressures they're under, we have to find systemic ways of redressing this too. We have to think about new structures. The way that once worked no longer does. And I think some organisations and professions are further along the journey to beginning to explore what does it look like to work differently. And I don't just mean that in the sense of the 4-day work week and those types of things, but going, just because this previous generation or this previous system or this is the way that we have institutionalized working up to this moment, we need to be bold enough to say, well, that isn't working. And so let's think about how we recreate it. There's that quote often used that no one gets fired for hiring IBM. And I sort of come back to that some of the time. That's sort of like that safety of doing the thing everyone else is doing, not stepping too far out, even if you kind of know it's not delivering you exceptional performance, like you're just kind of getting through, getting it done. I think that's a really big barrier. So that need for, whether we describe it as vulnerability in terms of leaders actually being prepared to say, hey, not only am I going to take a break, I'm going to talk about it because I actually want to normalize that for everyone else in this culture. or being bold enough to say, how do we reimagine the rhythm of what work looks like here? Because I'm pretty convinced the way we're doing it now is not getting the best out of us. Individually and collectively, they're critical conversations.
I'm actually going away and leave in a couple of weeks' time. I'm going away for 3 weeks, and I've told my team,
Beautiful.
I trust you to make the decisions that you need to make. You don't need me to check emails or tick something off for you. I trust you. That's why I've got you in the business, and I intend to take a break. I intend to disconnect. But I've got good people around me, and I've made them independent, and I do trust them to make decisions. And that
Well,
makes
you've empowered them,
yeah.
right? Like, I think that's one of the big things you see is sort of the counterintuitive behavior. I sort of say that I want to take a break, but then I still expect you to check in with me on every decision you're making, or I'm going to blow my head off at you if you've made a decision that's different to the one I would have made. It's like, well, hold on a minute. We're going to have to change our relationship with some of those things if it's going to be able to work. One, to truly give people a chance to step into roles and challenge themselves at a higher level, but 2, to make sure you can properly recharge the batteries.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you talk about 3 pillars being mindset, method, and mastery. Today, in your experience that you've had with leaders that you've worked with, which is the one we overlook the most?
Oh, it's a good question. I think the thing, it's maybe not overlooked, but I see it as the biggest gap, is method. And by that, I mean what I would describe as closing the knowing and doing gap. So a lot of what we need to be doing, I think most of us logically, intellectually go, oh, yes, it's a good idea that, for example, I take a break more regularly. It's a good idea that I think about how I broaden my peripheral vision by exploring or exposing myself to sources, conversations, etc., that are going to help me have points of data to triangulate, because we live in such uncertain times and I need to be thinking about how I stay ahead of where the puck's next going, etc. But the actual doing or taking those small steps, engaging in those types of behaviors, that disconnect between what we know we should be doing and sort of the reality of pulling through from a method standpoint, I think is probably the biggest gap. And when I meet and have the privilege of interviewing some of the incredible high-performing leaders that I get to meet, don't get me wrong, it's very clear they've done the work on their own mindset. They know what they stand for. They know what they believe in, all that piece. But the thing that's striking is the consistency and the discipline of their method and how good they are about understanding what produces great in them and making sure that they then commit to that routine and those disciplines. In some instances, that's the things like visualization, goal setting. In other instances, it's the preparation, it's having great coaches, it's continually working on your feedback process and getting better and better at your specific skills. But I would say method and making ourselves kind of students of method. In most organizations, frequent conversation that I'm having with leaders is around our general avoidance of feedback loops, our general reluctance to want to get a sense of where we're going, try something new, build new muscle, because it feels awkward to be a beginner and it's challenging to be outside of your comfort zone. And I don't really like it when I get constructive feedback. It's kind of why we do it once a year if we have to do it at all. So for me, that cauldron that is sort of or the gymnasium, that would be a better way to describe it, the gymnasium that is method, I would see is the biggest gap.
What else have you noticed in the leaders that you have interviewed? And for those who don't know, the likes of Barack Obama and Richard Branson, Condoleezza Rice, a number of athletes. What's the commonality that stands out across all of them?
I think part of what informed the writing of The Leading Edge, which gets to the structure you were describing there, sort of mindset, method, mastery, what's striking is the genuine sense to which these people have done the work on themselves and continue to do that work. It's not a sense that I've arrived. It's absolutely I'm on this journey of continual self-discovery and continually putting myself in situations and circumstances where I'm revealing new things about myself, where I'm challenging myself to apply myself in new ways. But there's a real sense of I know who I am. And in part that's been proactively developed. Generally speaking, these are people who have, a tendency to put themselves in situations or have done the work, go to the courses, ask the questions, take the opportunities. But there's a lot of having done it through some pretty challenging situations and circumstances too, like those crucible moments that we sometimes hear talk about. So there's definitely that piece. I think, as we discussed, there's a piece around method and sort of having a clear understanding of what do I need to do for me that allows me to be the best version of me. And how do I commit that to a rhythm and routine? And often that is that there is a specific thing that I make sure that I do in a day or in a week that is my reset button. Because these people who are making extraordinary decisions of a very high volume are contending with enormous amounts of pressure. For Barack Obama, it was playing basketball. For Richard Branson, it's certainly become athletic pursuits more recently, but he is a thrill seeker. He talks about how he's had a near-death experience for every year of his life. He loves kind of that challenge of, out of this world experiences. For someone like Simone Biles, who I interviewed the other week, absolutely there's a discipline to her routine, but she talks a lot about how fun and variety is so important. She has to continually find ways to make the volume of training she does interesting, and to take breaks after major championships to reset, go explore parts of the world she hasn't seen yet. So she rejuvenates sort of the batteries in that regard. And then I think there's this piece, mastery really gets into what are the practices we've got that allow us to continue to find our edge and kind of that cycle of renewal and challenge and pushing. And so there I think you're getting into the way these people lean on other voices and external perspectives and the work that they do to cultivate systems around themselves that are continually self-rejuvenating and encouraging of sort of that forward momentum. And I think that's a striking thing for me about when I think about a lot of the leaders I've worked with who are in very, let's term them like cognitively demanding roles. So captains of industry, leaders of nations, people who are making very consequential decisions. The demands of that are extraordinary. And the expectation that you're across an enormous amount of knowledge. Let's take President Clinton, President Obama. In 1 minute of getting a call, having to make a decision on the environment. The next you've got a national security issue. The next moment you're being asked your opinion on a foreign policy matter in a foreign country that you might not have had exposure to in some number of years. And then we're going to swap over here to health policy. They talk about the idea that you need to build strategies for that complexity and that cognitive overload. And a lot of them speak about the importance of the people you surround yourself with and the idea of having that network of trusted advisors who you can pick up the phone to and say, I need to get all across water policy. The decision that's facing me is this. The questions I've got for you, and this is the key for me, is the swap between leaders having all the answers to having actually better questions and then the strategies in place for how they get to the answers. A lot of them will talk you through the sounding boards, the people that they are throwing ideas around with, the deep expertise they can pull from their bench in order to enrich their thinking and perspective, and equally how they challenge themselves. That's not just about having technical expertise. I remember speaking to President Obama about how every time he visited a country during his presidency, he met with young people. He asked his team to convene a forum because he wanted to hear from the generation that were coming next. Now, I walk into a lot of rooms and I ask people right now, hands up who's got a mentor under the age of 30. And I'm doing well if I get more than 2 hands up. Doesn't matter how many thousand of people we're talking to in the room. And I think about the generational change that's coming through our workforce, our customer bases, from a foreign policy sense that's coming through Africa and the like. And I go, wow, that's a blind spot. What are we doing as leaders to be more thoughtful and deliberate around how do we engage here? So there for me, a couple of things that are really quite striking about thematics of tactics that you see and strategies that these leaders are using and obviously having incredible success with putting to work.
What inspired you to write The Leading Edge?
I think it came from a desire that sort of links back to our conversation around strategy. When you work with large organizations and you've been involved in a few strategic processes, and you have that realization that actually we don't rise to level our strategy, we rise to level our leadership. You realize, gosh, we need to be doing more to support leadership. And I have a lot of empathy for leaders in this period of time because I think by and large, we are asking leaders to do things we've not trained them for. We are still playing catch up with the way that we develop and educate our leaders. And by that, I mean, if you've been lucky enough to have any training at all, it probably was a little bit more to do with like leadership theory than maybe sort of some of the pedagogy of how we're asking people to apply their leadership in this day and age. There's a gap there. But equally, I think this gap around in a lot of organizations, like we're still moving from an industrial age model where you got promoted because you were technically brilliant. And so you might have been a really good mind planner or banker or insert, your technical profession. Now you're leading a team of 20 or 200 and nobody taught you how to do it. You don't even know if you really want to. And so for me, it was a desire to sort of distill down a blueprint for a modern day leader, drawing on these conversations I'm so privileged to have, working with some of the world's truly kind of leading performers and leading performing cultures, to say for anyone who's enough of a self-starter that they want to get in their hands the tools and ideas and frameworks that these leaders are using on a daily basis and make it part of their own. Let's make sure we can put that in the hand of every leader everywhere, because part of me really wants to democratize access to leadership development. I still think too often it's behind a pay, a time, or a network barrier that makes it untouchable for a lot of people. I mean, if you don't have the tens of thousands of dollars or the discretionary hours on top of work and caring responsibilities, or the access to be at the right company who happens to bring the right person in to teach you the skills, this stuff is not as readily available. And I think it desperately needs to be, because as you and I know, the transformation in our workplaces is happening so quickly. The evolution of sort of AI moving pure intellect more and more off the table, and increasingly what remains the core human capacity being that IQ, EQ fusion, those leadership capabilities that are thinking about how do we collaborate? How do we solve complex problems? What does it look like to build a culture of empathy that makes people feel engaged and where they want to show up? Those are sorts of things that we have typically not trained and developed all that well, that are now taking on an increasing focus. So it's not just sort of the people we're bringing into the workforce. For me, it's also the retraining and reskilling of all of us who are already in career and thinking about how do I continue to add value and play a role as the workplace dramatically reinvents itself.
What's your advice to leaders around being really self-sufficient around this training? Because sometimes a lot of people wait for the organization to do it, and it's not always going to be the right type of training because it's quite broad, right? I've got 50 leaders I need to train, and we're going to do the one topic or the one speaker, so it's quite generic and quite broad. What's your advice, particularly to emerging leaders, to say, grab this one and be responsible for it for yourself?
It's a great question, and it comes for me actually in the first instance back to one of my most powerful earliest reads. You might have read it. It's a book by Clayton Christensen, the late Harvard professor who also wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, one of the great thinkers of the last generation. And he wrote this very simple book called How Will You Measure Your Life, which was this application of business principles to thinking about your life. And there's a lot that I love about it, but just for the idea that you made me think of when you asked the question, he talks about, and this will date when he wrote it, but he says, show me the butt of your checkbook and I will show you what you value. Now, nowadays we say probably show me your bank statement, right? Yeah. But this idea I come back to regularly is if I ask you to show me how you allocated your time in the last 4 weeks or how you've invested over the last quarter, what could you point to that shows me you have planted some seeds that future you is going to be thankful for? And so for me, it's not about sort of you should all be going and doing this course or, everyone be signing up and doing that. It's more, have you made a commitment to yourself? And if not, take yourself to your favorite cafe next week, sit down and ask yourself the question with where I'm at and the goals that I've got, what's the gap that I want to go for this quarter? And what's going to be the small amount of time I'm going to allocate? Is it 15 minutes a week? Is it half an hour? Is it half a day every second Friday? Work out what that window is and then work out what it is that you're going to do and make it simple. One of the things I notice about a lot of A-types, which might be the case for a number of emerging leaders because they're very driven, goal-oriented, is we tend to seek to optimize before we establish. So find a way to start really small and go, your first afternoon could just be spent on Google, looking at what resources are out there and discovering what you think is better, or having a conversation with someone who you admire in this skill area and saying, hey, I'm trying to get better at this. Could you help me think through how to do it? And then make an allocation. Only you will know what it's right for you, but maybe, you give yourself a personal development budget. A lot of organizations will allocate $500 or $1,000, $2,000 to their people to develop each year. Now, there's no reason if your company doesn't do that, you can't choose to make your own investment. I think the single best investment you can make is the one that you make in your own development. So I would be thinking about that as a strategy to say, have you got that time blocked out next week? Can you come up with some answers to those questions and then block that time out? Look like, what did you learn from the journey you went on, in the last 3-6 months? And think about who are the handful of people that maybe have a level of observation in your work or in your element that can be thoughtful about how they feed into that process. So who can give you a little bit of playback to say, if you want to achieve that promotion next, I think you'd be really well placed to go and find a course or to spend some time shadowing or to go find 5 books and read about this topic, because that would be a really key area you're going to have to demonstrate to be able to get that promotion. So it can also be useful to have a little bit of outside perspective feeding into your personal development design.
You write and talk a lot about mattering, and it emerges a bit of a central theme for you. What does mattering mean to you?
I think mattering for me is a topic that we absolutely need to be talking about more, because I think what we know to be true about the research that exists is that we feel like people are working harder than ever and they can't shake this feeling that none of their work actually matters. And I keep hearing these stories from organisations. People are feeling like they've never been busier and yet they're strangely feeling less fulfilled. Burnout rate skyrocketed. So it's not like I'm not sure that it really has value, or I'm not sure that we know what it is that is the highest order contribution of our work, a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. AI gives you 5 hours back a week. Where does that time get redeployed? So I think we're at this interesting moment where everything's urgent, everything's important, and everything demands our attention right now. And we know that that can't work. Like when everything matters, nothing does. And so for me, there's this really interesting conversation that I'm getting into with leaders and with organizations to say, how do we solve for this misalignment? What does it look like to actually step back and go, what is high value humaning? This idea of what if high performance isn't about this kind of exponential output, but instead about directing our highest human capabilities towards what really matters? And then how do we create the frameworks for clarifying that? Because in a lot of organizations that I run leadership workshops and, do the strategic offsites for, when we challenge ourselves around, what are we working on? We can come up with 25 priorities. When we challenge ourselves to say, okay, well, what are we going to deprioritize? Like, how do we start to work out what matters more or what matters now? There's real friction and discomfort in that question. There's a lot of lack of clarity. And so unsurprisingly, what we're seeing is this dilution of focus, this exhaustion from an outcome standpoint, because we're just, keep hearing this phrase, we're trying to do more with less, we're trying to do more with less. And so for me, I'm really exploring this mattering framework around how do you know what matters, how do you do what matters, and how do you then multiply it? So actually thinking about scaling it, your impact across teams, and the kind of culture of recognition that reinforces it. So that's a real new line of inquiry for me that I'm excited to be hopefully writing some more material on, and certainly I'm starting to bring into a lot of the work that I'm doing with organisations in the not too distant future.
What are some of the red flags that organisations can look out for in terms of whether their people feel they matter or not?
Well, I think you can, we see it in some of the data already when you look at things like Gallup's, unfortunate statistics that haven't gotten better for, over a decade around how few people feel engaged or like their work matters. You see it a lot in organisational exit data and kind of the recognition data on the flip side of sort of what a difference it makes when someone feels more regularly and routinely recognised for their contribution. This sense, we see the data around attrition change. We see the data around kind of engagement and enjoyment of work change. So I think certainly you can be tracking your data around engagement in an organisation without question. We can definitely be checking data around burnout. I think you can get into some of the psych safety type territory too around, do we have permission to deprioritise here? Like where you start to go, are we actually good at getting into that debate and the allocation of effort and the robust conversation that needs to happen around where does effort truly go? So for me, there are probably a couple of immediate things you could be looking to say, information we're already gathering right now, we can probably start to pull some initial hypotheses and conclusions on this. I think the other thing we're thinking about, and it's similar to conversations I have with leaders around psych safety, typically the worst people to assess this are leaders themselves. And by that I mean you're in real trouble if your leaders don't think they matter. But typically, by virtue of stature, agency, etc., leaders will overcome some of the factors that might be creating a lack of mattering in the rest of the organisation. So another really important thing when you're gathering this data is to think about how do you disaggregate it and break it down according to departments, levels, generations, gender, culture, those types of things, to say, actually, we've got some blind spots here where we're really good at creating it in this pocket, but actually our frontline workers are absolutely not feeling like what they do matters. Or this team over here, or this type of person working in our organisation feels consistently and routinely undervalued. Like, what are we going to do to address that? So that for me is a catch, that if you sort of ask the question in the room of leaders, hey, people feel like they matter here? Everyone goes, yeah, of course they do. Like, we're a great place to work. It's like, no. We need to do a little bit better about how we're triangulating the data than that.
Yeah. And as you've been working on this, I'm interested to know, have you thought about an experience where you mattered in an organisation that you've worked with or worked in, and how did that shape your thinking or your leadership in that organisation?
Do you know what? It actually comes back to an even earlier memory for that than me, which was actually to when I was 10 years old at primary school. I was so lucky this particular weekend. We'd been out shopping in the centre of Perth, and I'd stumbled into a homeless guy. I'd walked out of the bookstore when I got bored. I wandered up to this guy that was collecting money and asked him what he was doing. And he said he was trying to earn enough to feed and a roof. And I sort of looked down and counted. There was $1.25 sitting in his hat. And I never should have said what I said next. But typical 10-year-old, I kind of went, well, that's not very much. And he chuckled. He was generous enough to sort of, engage with me on that. And he said, oh, this is actually a good day. I'm doing well. And I remember I sort of didn't grow up in the home environment where that was a topic that was going to be one around the dinner table. But I knew that was something that I needed adults to help me with and think through. And so I remember saving that up all weekend and then running. I was small enough at that age I could duck past the receptionist desk at school. So I ducked past the receptionist desk, knocked on the principal's door, didn't even wait for a response, just kind of wandered straight in, Mr. Teed's office on Monday morning, and told him what had happened. And I think all the time about how easy it would have been for him to say, Holly, I don't have time for this. Or don't you worry about that. That's not your concern. Or that's something that adults worry about. You're just a kid. But bless him, of all the things he had to deal with that Monday morning, he said, come in, why don't we have a conversation about that? And in everything he and my classroom teacher, Mrs. Allison, did in the response to that, there was a view that, yes, that was a problem. You're right to have identified that. So there was this affirmation of kind of, yeah, absolutely, that's a question you should be asking. But equally, there was this incredible power to being told, yeah, what could we do about that? Why don't we go and do something? Like, you think about it, we'll make it happen together. And so for me, that very simple interaction was this incredible gift to be given at such a young age, where there was no sense that you arrive at mattering when you turn 18, or all of a sudden when you get a CEO next to your name, or someone hands you the corner parking spot or that nice office or something like that. In reality, one, that's something we take for ourselves. And in many ways, in our interactions every day, we are either creating mattering, or we are, unfortunately, creating its other side, it's anti-mattering. We are being corrosive to the sense of mattering that other people have inside our organisations and cultures. So I can absolutely speak to leaders I work for who made every effort to, I shouldn't say leaders I work for, I was very lucky I never worked for one. I worked with leaders inside organisations where they would deliberately leave you off emails. They would walk into the office and say hello to everyone but you. Just these little ways they would sort of eat at your confidence and behaviour in the way they'd give you feedback and ignore certain things and then double down on others. And I've worked with leaders who were incredibly just gifted and deliberate around the way they say thank you, the way they ask for opinions and voices, the way that they acknowledge extra mile effort and contribution. And I think that's the thing we sometimes miss. Mattering isn't about having bucket loads of money to devote to new programs. A lot of it is about these day-to-day actions, these processes, these interactions we are already in that we need to nudge in a direction of mattering more. And that is within the influence and capability of every single one of us. And that's part of why I get so excited about this topic, is because it has such extraordinary power and it's so grabbable and gettable for each and every one of us. And I think sometimes when we talk about leadership concepts, they can be a bit too big, can feel a bit above some of our pay grades, etc. The thing I love about this is it's something each and every one of us can have this sense of almost a daily scoreboard or a credit and debit system. and be thinking about what's the way I nudge my credit score a little bit higher when it comes to the sense of mattering I'm creating with the people that I'm working with and in interacting with.
That's a whole conversation there, Holly, which
It's a big
we
one.
unfortunately don't have time for. But I want to go to our 4 questions that we ask all of our guests, which is what they
Sure.
see as a future fit leader. So if you had to describe a future fit leader in just 3 words, the kind of leader we'll need the most in the years ahead, what would they be and why?
Adaptable, courageous, and visionary.
And why those 3?
I think adaptability is absolutely future critical. There's just no question that your ability to evolve and continue to not just move with the pace of change, but almost do it in an anticipatory manner is going to be critical. I think there are a few competencies you could argue are more future critical than adaptation. I think courage, because of a lot of what we've talked about, the need for the future way that we do things to look fundamentally different, and that requires courage. It's hard to walk away from the way that we've done things and be prepared to offer an alternative or do something that feels uncharacteristic or unusual until it becomes the new norm. And so I think we need those types of leaders. And probably my split was on the third, whether you go for visionary or whether you go for optimistic. And I think probably implied in visionary is optimism. I don't think you can have a pessimistic visionary. Maybe you can. They write horror films and stuff like that, perhaps. But I think there's a piece around we need people who can envisage a better tomorrow. That I think it was Shackleton who sort of talked about optimism as an act of moral courage. But that idea of being able to chart a course, I think, begins with the belief that there's somewhere worth heading to. There's a destination that is more prosperous than where we are right now. So I think that'd be my 3 for those reasons.
Okay. What's one future shift coming in the next few years that you think most leaders are underestimating or not prepared for?
I mean, AI is too obvious to say that's well and truly underway. I think probably related to that conversation we were having earlier is just the dramatic nature of the pace of change, the cognitive demands and complexity only intensifying. And with that specifically, the personal and the collective systems or the rethinking of the way that we work that's going to be required to navigate that. I think for me, that's a really critical topic. For all the stuff we've been talking about, we're already seeing the indicators showing us that the way we're working doesn't work. And so I think when you know that that's only intensifying, that's an area of concern for me that we're ill-equipped for that.
What do you wish more leaders were paying closer attention to?
It's interesting where I've actually landed, because you go in so many directions on sort of, different macro issues and stuff like that but it's probably their people for what we've been talking about. We're seeing a lot of data that suggests this kind of widening disconnect between, for example, the purpose that leaders feel and the purpose the everyday person in the organisation feels, the burnout rates, the recognition and reward, this bifurcation of sort of the haves and the have-nots, which you can play out through a couple of different layers in kind of political conversations across the world at the moment too. I think we need to be really closely attuned to that. We need to understand it better. We need to be more reflective and self-critical. And so I think that would be one for me. I think we need to not think that's just an issue for politicians. I think that's an issue in organisations. But I think paying attention to that issue full stop is something leaders should be thinking about.
And what are the possibilities or shifts you see in the future of leadership or work that really excites you and why?
I think it's such an interesting and exciting time to be alive and to be a leader, in large part because of just the extraordinary opportunity, the tools available to scale ideas and thinking, to be able to get a business off the ground. The way that we've broken down so many barriers to entry and barriers to scale is so incredibly energizing. And so for me, it's really exciting to think about being a leader at this moment in time and having the ability to go, I conceive of something and I can bring that idea to life in a meaningful way at probably a greater speed, with a lower cost and with a greater scale than has ever been afforded at any period in history. Like, what a time to have those tools at our disposal. I think the challenge is making sure we're putting that discretionary effort into that experimentation. And we're not, to your point earlier around waiting for the organisation, we're not waiting for someone else to do it for us.
My last question is, if you could embed one leadership quality into every current or future CEO, something you believe will be essential in the next decade, what would it be and why?
Definitely curiosity. I think the need to be asking questions of ourselves, more thoughtfully of the people that we surround ourselves with, more question asking than opinion offering, and the need to be able to question with intent that sort of this is the way we do things here, and really as an unlock for the new thinking or the permission that we need to begin to dream a new way. Curiosity would be the big one for me.
Holly, thank you for joining us on Future Fit Leadership. It's been wonderful. I could talk to you all day, but we don't.
Oh, right,
Can't do that.
I've had a blast, so thank you for having me.
It's been good fun. Thank you so much for making the time for joining us.
Appreciate it.
If you like what you've heard, please share, rate and review this podcast. And don't forget to share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of my social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting to your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.